unique aspects of an informational stimulus, and locating it within a pre-existing intellectual frame or cognitive class, as in, X is a dog, i.e., member of the dog category. Accommodation, correspondingly, represents openness and sensitivity to the unique features of the new information, as in noticing what kind of dog X is, its color, shape, gender, or breed. Flavel, 1963, put it as follows: assimilation refers to the fact that every cognitive encounter with an environmental object necessarily involves some kind of cognitive structuring of that object in accord with the nature of the organism's existing intellectual organization. To adapt intellectually to reality is to construe that reality, in terms of some enduring construct within oneself. The essence of accommodation is a process of adapting oneself to the variegated requirements or demands which the world of objects imposes upon one. Page 48. Piaget does not address circumstances or variables that affect the relative strength of assimilation or accommodation processes. Rather, in his framework, they are simultaneous and indissociable as they operate in living cognition. Adaptation is a unitary event, and assimilation and accommodation are merely abstractions from this unitary reality. Flavel, 1963. For Piaget, smooth joint functioning of assimilation and accommodation represents how a cognitive ensemble containing closed systems of activity is nonetheless open to, and interactive with, the environment. Such conception of normal functioning depicts cognitive stability, and has relatively little to say about the possibility of a genuine cognitive change or alteration of prior schemas under the impact of new information. By contrast, in the present theoretical framework, stability is coordinated to closed-mindedness and change to open-mindedness. A different Piagetian sense of closed and open-mindedness, expressly referring to cognitive change, is that of equilibration. Piaget, 1975–1985. According to this concept, a schema is assumed to endure, to the extent that assimilation and accommodation are in equilibrium, that is, to the extent that the modifications introduced into the scheme through accommodation are effected without loss of continuity in functioning. Chapman, 1988, page 291. The possibility of change derives from disequilibria that occasionally arise and stimulate cognitive activity aimed at reequilibration. Such disequilibria reside in contradictions that the cognitive system may encounter, and that produce perturbations within it. Piaget attached considerable importance to these disequilibria, noting that one of the sources of progress in the development of knowledge must be sought in disequilibria as such. Because disequilibria alone force the subject to go beyond his current state and strike out in new directions. Page 10. Piaget identified three distinct ways in which an organism may react to perturbatory inconsistencies. In alpha reactions, the most primordial of the lot, perturbations are simply ignored or removed. Beta reactions are somewhat more refined, entailing, as they do, a differentiation into subtypes, one of which continues to display the property originally assumed to characterize the class as a whole, and another now assumed to display the opposite property. Finally, gamma reactions represent the most complete and thoroughgoing reactions, involving, as they do, the anticipation of possible perturbations. Insofar as these possible variations are fully integrated into the system, they lose their character of perturbations and simply become potential transformations of the system. Chapman, 1988, page 297. According to Piaget, the progression from alpha to gamma reactions does not necessarily track the stages of cognitive development, and can take place at different developmental levels, from the sensory-motor to the operational stage. Cognitive consistency theories. Piaget's notions of equilibration, perturbation, and reequilibration are strongly reminiscent of the cognitive consistency theories in social psychology. In that work, too, A State of Cognitive Imbalance, Heder, 1958, Incongruency, Osgood and Tannenbaum, 1958, or Dissonance, Festinger, 1957, among other similar notions, closely akin to Piagetian Disequilibrium is assumed to arouse a motivation or need aimed at the restoration of equilibrium, balance, congruity, or consonance. The cognitive consistency theorists typically assumed that the drive toward consistency is universal and that it is aroused by the appearance of a cognitive inconsistency, i.e., a salient logical contradiction among an individual's conscious beliefs. Cf. Kruglanski and Kla, 1987, Kruglanski, 1989, pp. 86-100. In Festinger's, 1957, formulation, moreover, the magnitude of the motivational arousal due to an inconsistency is partially determined by the importance to the individual of the clashing cognitions, even though the importance concept was never precisely defined in Festinger's formulation. The modes of inconsistency reduction discussed by the cognitive consistency theorists also bear a strong resemblance to Piaget's notions. Thus, Abelson, 1959, 1968, proposed that inconsistency may be resolved via several different modes including denial, bolstering, differentiation, transcendence, and rationalization, wherein denial strongly resembles Piaget's alpha reaction, differentiation the beta reaction, and transcendence the integrative solution of Piaget's gamma reaction. 1. The motive to resolve uncertainty. Kagan's 1972 analysis of the motive to resolve uncertainty is explicitly tied to notions of cognitive consistency, such as balance, equilibrium, or dissonance, page 57. However, whereas the cognitive consistency theorists did not elaborate extensively on why inconsistency is aversive, other than invoking the need or drive toward consistency, Kagan made an important step in relating inconsistency to uncertainty arousal, the resolution of which he viewed as a primary motive or the wish to know, page 54. As he put it, uncertainty leads to a primary motive to resolve it, and if no appropriate responses are available, distress, anxiety, fear, shame or guilt may occur, page 54. In fact, Kagan went so far as to assert that most of the popular motives normally ascribed to children and adults by novelists or psychologists in Western culture, such as achievement, affiliation, power, dependency, nurturance, or succurrence, can be derivatives of a primary motive to resolve uncertainty and alleviate subsequent affective distress, p. 5.4. In his emphasis on uncertainty resolution, Kagan fundamentally anticipated the present epistemic approach to closed-mindedness. In particular, our key construct of the need for non-specific closure denotes a desire for firm knowledge, highly akin to Kagan's, page 54, concept of the wish to know. Those important similarities notwithstanding, unlike the present theory, Kagan's and Piaget's analyses, as well as the cognitive consistency theories imply that a state of openness, 1, is forced or imposed upon the individual by discovery of an inconsistency among her or his cognitions, 2, is psychologically aversive, particularly where the cognitions are important to the individual, Festinger, 1957, and 3. Leads to a motivational need state aimed at reducing the unpleasant inconsistency, i.e., by restoring consonance, balance, or equilibrium, and resolving the uncertainty. In contrast, the present analysis suggests that a motivation for a non-specific or specific cognitive closure may often antedate, rather than follow, the discovery of an inconsistency. For example, according to the present theory, the desire to have closure may be prompted by the need to make an important decision or undertake an action. The desire for closure may also be fostered by various contextual conditions or momentary states, such as the state of fatigue or conditions of time pressure or noise. All of these may precede the receipt of any information on a topic, including the receipt of any inconsistent information. Similarly, the desire to believe that some impatiently awaited news about the result of one's annual checkup, a panel's decision on one's grant, or a marriage proposal, will be desirable or congruent with one's wishes, representing a need for a specific, desirable, closure, requires no prior cognitive inconsistency for it to exist and be strongly felt. Finally, unlike Kagan, Piaget, and the cognitive consistency theorists, the present analysis does not assume that states of open-mindedness, the absence of a cognitive commitment, or inconsistency are invariably unpleasant or aversive. In fact, it envisages circumstances where such states might be strongly desired and strived for. The present concept of the need to avoid non-specific closure represents a state in which judgmental non-commitment, continued uncertainty, and ambiguity, far from being unpleasant and threatening, may feel rather appealing and comfortable to an individual and represent the person's preferred epistemic end state. Seeking and rejecting information. Seeking information. The notions that humans pervasively experience the wish to know, and hence generally crave cognitive closure, has been embraced by other theoretical conceptions in social psychology of more recent vintage than the cognitive consistency theories. Though quite different in focus, these formulations continued to subscribe to the notion that persons generally crave stable and coherent knowledge and do not put their mind to rest until they possessed it. This view seems common to social psychological formulations addressing such seemingly opposite phenomena as the quest for, versus the rejection of, information. Festinger's 1954 theory of social comparison processes, for example, stresses the quest for, or openness to, certain kinds of information, cf. Sorrentino and Roney, 1999. Festinger postulated a drive to assess our abilities and opinions, prompting the comparison with similar persons capable of affording the requisite assessment. Trope, 1975, 1986, similarly, emphasized people's desire for self-assessment that assists them in making the right choices, and hence ultimately mediating positive outcomes leading to self-enhancement. The self-assessment need prompts the search for diagnostic or veridical information, even if in the short run it may represent bad news, e.g., by revealing one's low ability in some domain, it may afford the opportunity to correct one's mistakes, thus improving one's likelihood of attaining the desired objectives. It is of course likely that both the need of self-assessment and that of self-enhancement would vary widely across situations and persons. For some people, or for most people in some situations, the truth about oneself may represent the overriding concern regardless of its consequences. For other people, and or for most people in some situations, judgmental consequences, e.g., their implications for one's self-esteem, may loom more importantly than the truth, albeit not necessarily at a conscious level. If so, the question as to which motive is the prepotent one, i.e., the self-assessment or the self-enhancement motive, may not have a general answer. Rather, it may all depend on the person and/or on the situation. The contextual dependency of various motivations for information processing, e.g., the need for accurate assessment, is highlighted in recent theories of persuasion and attitude change, Chaikin, Lieberman, and Eagerly, 1989, Petty and Cacioppo, 1986, Kruglansky and Thompson, 1999 A, B. These formulations typically assume that in situations characterized by the recipient's high personal involvement in an issue, that is, where holding the correct attitude or opinion matters to the recipients, they will be strongly motivated to safeguard the accuracy of their attitudinal judgment, which in turn may prompt a relatively thorough and meticulous information processing activity. By contrast, in situations characterized by low personal involvement, the motivation for accuracy would be lower, with corresponding reduction in the extent of informational search and elaboration. Rejection of information. Some social psychological theories have stressed people's avoidance of specific types of information. Swan's, 1990, self-verification theory, for example, highlights people's avoidance of self-disconfirming information or information inconsistent with one's view of oneself. According to Swan, stability of self-conception is needed for the maintenance of subjective assurance essential for everyday living. In support of this theory, Swan and his colleagues have demonstrated that even when people's self-conceptions are negative, they often avoid information that contradicts them, e.g., Swan and Pelham, 1988, Swan, Wenslaff, Krull, and Pelham, 1992. Note that even though Swan's theory stresses the avoidance of self-disconfirming information, whereas the self-assessment notions of Festinger, 1954, or Trope, 1975, stress the quest for, or approach to, information, all three conceptions assume individuals' general desire for secure knowledge, i.e., closure, on some topics. To the extent that such closure was absent, attempts to form it were assumed to prompt an informational quest, whereas if it was present already, attempts to maintain it were assumed to prompt the avoidance of potentially undermining information threatening to usher in uncertainty and ambiguity. By contrast, the present approach assumes that the need for closure can vary, and that rather than universally wishing to attain or maintain closure, in some situations people would be motivated to actively eschew it, as noted earlier. 1. Notions of closed and open-mindedness in Freud's theorizing. The structural analysis of the psyche. Though Sigmund Freud was not directly concerned with issues of closed and open-mindedness, his work alluded to these and related matters in several ways. First, his structural division of the psyche into the id, the ego, and the superego represents a psychological framework that constrains the ways in which information enters consciousness. Information incompatible with societal values, located in the superego, e.g., about hostile or sexual feelings toward one's parents, located in the id, will be repressed and kept outside the gates of our conscious mind. In a different way, our wishes and fantasies originating in id-based impulses are prevented from ensconcing us in a cocoon of dream-like realities by forces of the ego that keep our mental gates open to society and the world. In this sense then, the ego is related to open-mindedness, whereas the id and the defenses against its impulses represent forms of closed-mindedness. Mechanisms of defense. Whereas the id, if let to have its way, would give rise to specific closures desirable from its primordial perspective, Freud's notion of defense mechanisms highlights a specific type of closed-mindedness stemming from the need to avoid specific closures. Kruglansky, 1989. Such closed-mindedness consists in the filtering out of certain types of ideation through a resource-depleting repression. For instance, in discussing the notion of taboo, Freud writes, "The prohibition does not merely apply to immediate physical contact but has an extent as wide as the metaphysical use of the phrase, to come in contact with. Anything that directs the patient's thoughts to the forbidden object, anything that brings him into intellectual contact with it, is just as much prohibited as direct physical contact." Strachey, 1955, Vol. 13, page 27. And on the resource-depleting nature of repression, Freud writes, "The ego is obliged to protect itself against the constant threat of a renewed advance on the part of the repressed impulse by making a permanent expenditure of energy, an anti-cathexis, and it thus impoverishes itself." Sigmund Freud, An Autobiographical Study, page 30, in Strachey, 1955, Vol. XX. Ambivalence. Whereas the notion of defense mechanisms represents a kind of closed-mindedness, Freud's notion of ambivalence represents a kind of emotional open-mindedness, if by that term is meant an affective incertitude and the inability to decide between opposite emotional responses towards significant others. The notion of ambivalence has been the cornerstone of Freud's psychoanalytic theory, and has been commented on and analyzed by various interpreters, e.g., Merton, 1963. 1976, Levine, 1977, 1985, and Smelser, 1998. Smelser, 1998, for example, notes the original use of the ambivalence concept by Bleuler in 1910, and its subsequent influence on Freud, who used it pervasively, e.g., in his interpretation of dreams, analysis of sadomasochism, or theory of the Oedipal relations between child and parent. According to Smelser, Freud's prototypical setting for the development of ambivalence is the young child, who is dependent on his or her parents in many ways, for survival as an organism, as authorities on what to think or do, and emotionally dependent on them because it loves them. Childhood entails a type of enslavement from which one cannot escape. The child objects of ambivalence are those by whom he or she is entrapped, parents and siblings. Adolescence is the protracted experience of partial escape, a period in which ambivalence toward parents and siblings is repeatedly acted out, sometimes in extreme ways. The escape is never complete, however. The enslaved child inside us never totally sheds its ambivalence toward parents and siblings, and this ambivalence finds expression in recurrent transference to authorities, colleagues, subordinates, loved ones, friends, gods, demons, heroes, and scapegoats, pp. 8 to 9. In short, ambivalence, or the inability to reach or sustain emotional closure toward important figures in one's interpersonal environment, represents a kind of openness that plagues most of our significant social relations, according to Freud. To summarize, Freud's theorizing did not focus directly on issues of closed and open-mindedness. Nonetheless, his work did touch upon certain kinds of closed-mindedness, such as avoidance of specific types of information leading to undesirable, ego-threatening closures, and the kind of effective open-mindedness immanent in the notion of ambivalence. The impact of psychoanalysis on the topics of closed and open-mindedness is not restricted to Freud's own theorizing, however. Various subsequent interpretations of psychodynamic notions served as the theoretical backdrop for several individual difference constructs whose relevance to these topics was much more focal and direct than was Freud's original work. The individual difference approach to closed and open-mindedness is examined next. Individual difference approaches to closed and open-mindedness. Der Gegentypus. Issues of closed and open-mindedness came into the limelight during the advent and subsequent defeat of Nazism and fascism, as psychologists of various stripes attempted to defend or explain the political ideologies leading to the globe-shattering events of World War II. Arguably, the first such effort was that of Erich Jansch, 1938, the Nazi psychologist, who in his volume Der Gegentypus, the Antitype, identified the orientation toward cognitive clarity as a significant personality variable. Jansch's work regarded the traits of consistency, stability, firmness, and decision-making confidence as the hallmarks of normalcy and good mental health rooted in the individual's perceptual functioning. According to Jansch, the perceptual process of a normal, psychologically healthy individual is characterized by a stable coordination between objectively determined points in space and their corresponding locations on the retina. In stark contrast, the antitype manifests a notable lack of such coordination. Her spatial perception is labile and fleeting, and these perceptual characteristics are paralleled by cognitive and social liberalism. For Jansch, the antitype represented a morbid psychological disposition and a menace to the purity of the German culture and public life, cf. Levine, 1985, page 12. His own conception of cognitive clarity as the epitome of sanity was much in accord with the Nazi ideology and in stark contrast with the Gestalt theoretic emphasis on the essential ambiguity of perceptual processes, which Jansch vigorously criticized. A reversal of Jansch's position was articulated in a post-war magnum opus on the authoritarian personality published in 1950 by Adorno, Fring, Kell Brunswick, Levinson, and Sanford. In counter-distinction to Jansch's emphasis, the work on the authoritarian personality saw excessive quest for clarity and the tendency to perceive the world in unambiguous, black-white terms as a sign of a deep-seated pathology. I turn now to briefly consider this work and the subsequent research that it inspired. Authoritarianism. The work on the authoritarian personality represented a confluence of two streams of thought: 1. Frankfurt School-inspired Marxist theories of ideology and social structure, and 2. Freudian theories of child rearing and personality development. Accordingly, Adorno et al., 1950, proposed that harsh parenting styles encouraged by economic stringencies lulled entire generations to repress hostility toward authority figures and supplant it by excessive deference and idealization coupled with exaggerated conventionalism and hostility towards societal scapegoats and cultural deviants, like Jews, homosexuals, or people of color. Parental harshness and strict disciplinary styles were assumed to engender particular difficulties for the offspring in passages through the oral and the anal stages of psychosexual development, fomenting a sense of basic mistrust and hence resistance to novel or unconventional ideas. The authoritarian personality, according to Adorno et al., sent the conjunction of 9 traits. 1. Conventionalism defined as the rigid adherence to conventional middle-class values. 2. Authoritarian submission or submissive, uncritical attitudes to idealized moral authorities of the in-group. 3. Authoritarian aggression or the tendency to be vigilant to infractions of conventional norms and the inclination to condemn, reject, and punish the perpetrators. 4. Anti-introception, involving the opposition to the subjective, the imaginative, and the tender-minded. 5. Superstition and stereotypy, rolling together mystical beliefs about people's destinies and the inclination to think in rigid categories. 6. Power and toughness, that is, the preoccupation with the dominance-submission dimension of human relations. Exaggerated assertion of one's own strength, and identification with power figures. 7. Destructiveness and cynicism in regard to human affairs. 8. Projectivity of one's own wild and dangerous impulses onto the perceptions of other people and external events. And 9. Sex or a preoccupation with and concern about alleged unconventional and hence untoward sexual behavior on the part of others. A measure designed to tap these various tendencies was labeled the F scale, for fascism. In support of their theoretical notions, case studies carried out by Adorno et al. Found that high authoritarians, as assessed by the F scale, showed evidence of both the putative developmental causes of the authoritarian personality and of their psychological effects. As to putative causes, high authoritarians tended to describe their home environment as relatively severe and threatening, and their family relationships as based on clearly defined roles of dominance and submission. Family relationships were characterized by fearful subservience to the demands of the parents and by an early suppression of impulses not acceptable to them, page 385. The educational objectives of parents of high authoritarians tended to be highly conventional. What is socially accepted and what is helpful in climbing the social ladder is considered good, and what deviates, what is different, and what is socially inferior is considered bad, page 385. This, in turn, was assumed to produce a strong and largely unconscious ambivalence toward one's parents, and externalization of the superego, with the punishing and rewarding authority seen as being outside rather than inside of oneself, page 454. As to alleged psychosexual effects, Adorno et al. Predicted and obtained an insignificant trend showing that high scorers on a measure of authoritarianism, the F scale, rejected erotic orality. High authoritarians tended to defend themselves against both the direct oral urge, e.g., indulgence in food, drinking, smoking, etc., as well as its various sublimations, including indulgence in talking, artistic interests, etc. p. 447. High authoritarians were also found to reject the anal syndrome, and exhibit responses known technically as anal reaction formations, including rigid moralistic patterns of behavior as well as excessive emphasis in, and preoccupation with, such issues as money, neatness, good clean life and hard work. Page 448. In Adorno et al.'s work, the F scale correlated 0.73 with ethnocentrism, 0.53 with antisemitism, and 0.52 with conservatism. The subsequent years have seen a proliferation of research with the F scale in a wide variety of correlational studies. In the 1950s, the scale was found to correlate with misanthropy, nationalism, and militarism, see Eckhart and Lentz, 1971, page 22. Kohlberg, 1964, reported that the F scale correlated -0.52 with moral maturity, and in a comparison of British fascists with British communists, it turned out that the former obtained a higher mean score on the F scale. Brown, 1965, pp. 527 to 528. In the 1960 election, Kennedy supporters were found to be less authoritarian than Nixon supporters. Leventhal, Jacobs, and Cuddy, 1964. Furthermore, high authoritarians tended to vote Republican in the United States and tended to sympathize with the political right in England and in India. Hansen. 1975. The F-scale was extensively reviewed and commented on, e.g., c. Rokich, 1960, Rosenberg, 1965, Scott, 1965, Shields, 1954, Christie and Jahoda, 1954, Titus and Hollander, 1957, Eckhart, 1991. Altemeyer, 1981. 1988, undertook an exhaustive critique of authoritarian personality research and put forth his own model of right-wing authoritarianism in response to what he saw as serious conceptual and measurement problems associated with the previous work. The conceptual part of the critique was aimed at the perceived imprecision and vagueness of the authoritarian personality model. The model of authoritarian personality assumed a conjunction of as many as 9 traits, yet, in fact, even more psychological constructs are involved in Adorno et al.'s 1950 list. For example, stereotypy and superstitiousness are hardly the same trait, yet they are rolled into one in Adorno et al.'s conception. Altemeyer, 1981, similarly questioned the isomorphism implied in Adorno et al.'s work of power and toughness, and of destructiveness and cynicism, page 15. Furthermore, the wording of the trait concepts did not give a specific enough sense of what the traits were meant to represent. As Altemeyer put it, calling conventionalism, the rigid adherence to conventional, middle-class values, does not give a very specific idea of what the trait is supposed to, page 15. From the methodological perspective, Altemeyer, 1981, argued that many of the items on the F-scale were intended to simultaneously tap several of the constituent traits of the authoritarian personality. Further methodological critiques of the F-scale, such as susceptibility to response sets, led Altemeyer to conclude that the test measures very little which is identifiable and comprehensible, page 25. As an alternative, Altemeyer, pp. 147 to 148, proposed his construct of right-wing authoritarianism, including the covariation of 3 attitudinal clusters. 1. Authoritarian submission, a high degree of submission to the authorities who are perceived to be established and legitimate in the society in which one lives. 2. Authoritarian aggression, a general aggressiveness directed against various persons, which is perceived to be sanctioned by established authorities, and 3. Conventionalism, a high degree of adherence to the social conventions which are perceived to be endorsed by society and its established authorities. Altemeyer's measurement tool for tapping this threefold construct was the right-wing authoritarianism scale that in numerous studies was found to have scientifically important relationships with most of the authoritarianism criteria under consideration, page 213, such as continued acceptance of the home religion, preference for right-wing political parties, harsh punishment of peers in learning situations, high degree of punitiveness toward lawbreakers, and acceptance of violations of the law by authority figures. As to the developmental origins of right-wing conservatism, Altemeyer criticized the psychoanalytic approach of Adorno et al., 1950, for a lack of adequate evidence. As he put it, the early childhood origins of authoritarianism may be taken for granted in our culture today, and the theory might be valid. But there is little scientific support for it so far, p. 254. As an alternative, Altemeyer, 1981, proposed a social learning approach to account for the evolution of the authoritarian attitude cluster. Especially, he proposed that people acquire authoritarian attitudes, a. from other people, through direct tuition and through imitation, and b. through their own experience with the objects of these attitudes. The determinant of what attitude is learned is the reinforcement the person receives for learning the attitude. and the reinforcement he receives from his interaction with the object of the attitude, according to Principles of Social Learning Theory, Bandura, 1977. Whether in its original, Adorno's et al.'s 1950 version, or its more recent version developed by Altemeyer, 1981, 1988, 1996, the concept of authoritarian ISM shares obvious common features with that of closed-mindedness. The tendencies toward idealized, moralistic thinking in black and white terms and rigid categories, rabid conventionalism and the tenacious adherence to societal norms, worship of authority, the differentiation between persons on dimensions of power and status, the tendencies toward prejudice and stereotyping, all cohere with the present theoretical notion of closed-minded individuals who crave clear-cut knowledge of their social realities, rooted in the firm foundation of the prevailing consensus, hence conventional. Such individuals may indeed be aggressively intolerant of breaches in their worldviews perpetrated by dissenting minorities, liberal types, or members of various outgroups. As to the putative antecedents of the authoritarian personality, I view both the psychodynamic notions and the social learning hypotheses as tapping possible contributing factors in the development of a closed-minded psychological system. It is quite possible, from the present perspective, that parental harshness and disciplinary strictness could encourage the perception that there are right and wrong ways of doing things, and that knowledge of the former belongs with authority figures and is encrypted in social norms. This may well encourage a generalized quest for clarity in the estuary of ambiguity and confusion. Furthermore, it is quite possible that authoritarian attitudes and closed-minded dispositions are also acquired via social learning from significant others in one's environment who espouse such attitudes and dispositions and reinforce them in others. Intolerance of ambiguity. Closely related to authoritarian personality research, yet distinct from it both methodologically and substantively, was Frankel Brunswick's work on the intolerance of ambiguity. In an abstract published in The American Psychologist in 1948, she reported a study with 100 adults and 200 children, 9 to 14 years of age, having to do with attitudes toward ethnic prejudice. Frankel Brunswick argued that ambiguity tolerance constitutes a general personality variable manifesting itself in relation to prejudice, but also to a broad range of further social and cognitive variables. As she put it, individuals intolerant of ambiguity are significantly more often given to dichotomous conceptions of the sex roles, of the parent-child relationship, and of interpersonal relationships in general. They are less permissive and lean toward rigid categorization of cultural norms. Power weakness, cleanliness dirtiness, morality immorality, conformance divergence are the dimensions through which people are seen. There is sensitivity against qualified, as contrasted with unqualified, statements and against perceptual ambiguity, a disinclination to think in terms of probability, a comparative inability to abandon mental sets in intellectual tasks, such as in solving mathematical problems, after they have lost their appropriateness. Frankel Brunswick, 1948a. In subsequent papers, Frankel Brunswick, 1948b, 1949, 1951, developed further the theory of ambiguity tolerance and elaborated its antecedent conditions and its manifold consequences. As to the antecedents, she viewed ambiguity tolerance in Freudian terms as the consequence of an underlying emotional conflict between strong ambivalence toward one's parents, involving feelings of hostility in combination with glorification tendencies developed in partial reaction to the hostility. The primordial ambivalence toward the parents was assumed to generalize to ambivalent attitudes toward sex and to one's own social identity. The consequences of low ambiguity tolerance were hypothesized to include the tendencies to seek certainty by clinging to the familiar, by distorting the meaning of information, and by imposing on it simplistic clichés and stereotypes. In a recent review of ambiguity tolerance research, Furnham and Ribchester, 1995, list the following additional consequences claimed for the intolerance of ambiguity: resistance to reversal of apparent fluctuating stimuli, The early selection and maintenance of one solution in a perceptually ambiguous situation, inability to allow for the possibility of good and bad traits in the same person, acceptance of attitude statements representing a rigid, black-white view of life, seeking for certainty. A rigid dichotomizing into fixed categories, premature closure, and remaining closed to familiar characteristics of stimuli, page 180. Thus, the ambiguity tolerance construct represents a combination of psychodynamic antecedents and a wide range of consequences encompassing perceptual and cognitive processes, but also a host of social and ideological attitudes, e.g., in regard to authority, power, or cleanliness. Arguably, it is this richness of implications that accounts for the considerable and persistent interest in this concept over the 50 years since its introduction. A considerable amount of research on ambiguity tolerance was conducted in various parts of the world between the late 1950s and the mid-1970s, e.g., Block and Block, 1950, Bhushan, 1970, Eysenck, 1954. Feather, 1969, Sidanuiz, 1978. This work employed a wide variety of measurement techniques. Frankel Brunswick herself assessed ambiguity tolerance, from case study material obtained in interviews. Block and Block, 1950, measured it by the number of trials a participant took to establish an individual norm in the autokinetic situation. A number of questionnaire measures of it were devised, the first being Walk's A scale, reproduced by O'Connor, 1952. Other similar tests were